The rain hammered against the windows of Amara Williams' tiny studio apartment in downtown Seattle, creating a rhythmic percussion that matched the pounding of her anxious heart. At 26 years old, 5 months pregnant, and completely alone, she sat cross-legged on her worn-out couch, staring at her laptop screen where an overdue invoice glared back at her in bold red letters. The graphic design project she'd poured her heart into for the past 3 weeks had just been rejected, and with it went her hopes of making next month's rent. Amara pressed her palm against her growing belly, feeling the gentle flutter of movement that never failed to make her smile despite everything else falling apart around her. Her baby, her little miracle, was the only thing keeping her going since Marcus had walked out 6 weeks ago. The memory of that conversation still stung like an open wound. He'd looked at her with cold, distant eyes and said the words that shattered her world, "I'm not ready to be a father. I never wanted this." Then he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a drawer full of his forgotten socks and a heart she wasn't sure would ever fully heal. She picked up her phone, scrolling through her sparse contact list until she found her best friend Jasmine's name. Jazz had been her rock through everything. The morning sickness, the tears, the panic attacks at 3 in the morning when the weight of single motherhood felt too heavy to bear. Amara needed her friend's encouragement now more than ever. She stood up slowly, her hand supporting her lower back, and walked to the full-length mirror leaning against the wall beside her kitchenette. The woman staring back at her looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her brown eyes, and her natural curls were pulled back into a messy bun that had given up trying to look presentable hours ago. But there was something else there too, a softness, a glow that came from the life growing inside her. Amara placed both hands on her rounded belly and managed a small smile. Whatever happened, whatever struggles lay ahead, this baby was wanted. This baby was loved. She angled her phone, trying to find the right lighting in her dimly lit apartment. After several attempts, she captured a mirror selfie that showed her baby bump clearly, her hand resting protectively over it, her smile genuine despite the exhaustion etched across her features. Without thinking too much about it, afraid she might lose her nerve, Amara typed a message to accompany the photo. 22 weeks today. Still scared out of my mind, but look at this beautiful belly. Tell me everything's going to be okay? Her thumb hovered over the send button for just a moment before she pressed it, watching the message whoosh away into the digital ether. She set her phone down and shuffled to the kitchen to make herself some tea, doctor's orders to stay hydrated and try to relax, though relaxation felt like a foreign concept these days. Meanwhile, across the city in the penthouse suite of the Kong Tower, Min-joon sat at the head of a massive mahogany table, his dark eyes fixed on the 3 men before him with the intensity of a predator. At 32, Min-joon had built an empire that straddled 2 worlds, the legitimate tech industry that made him a respected businessman in Seattle's corporate circles, and the shadowy underworld that whispered his name with fear and respect in equal measure. He was the youngest head of the Kong family organization, a position he'd earned not through birthright but through ruthless intelligence and an unwavering ability to make the hard decisions others couldn't stomach. The meeting was tense. One of his associates had made an unauthorized move that jeopardized a carefully orchestrated deal worth millions. Min-joon's expression remained perfectly neutral, but everyone in the room could feel the dangerous energy radiating from him. His second-in-command, Park Jin-woo, sat to his right, hands folded on the table, waiting for the inevitable explosion. That's when Min-joon's personal phone buzzed on the table, a sound so rare during business meetings that all 3 men across from him visibly tensed. Min-joon never allowed interruptions. Never. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he reached for the device, ready to silence whatever notification had dared to disturb him. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number, and beneath it, an image loaded. Min-joon's eyes, trained to assess threats and opportunities in milliseconds, took in the photograph of a pregnant woman standing before a mirror. She was black, beautiful in an understated way that had nothing to do with makeup or styling and everything to do with the genuine emotion in her expression. Her hand rested on her swollen belly with such tenderness that something in Min-joon's chest constricted painfully. The smile on her face was small, vulnerable, hopeful, everything his world wasn't. Jin-woo leaned slightly toward him, trying to catch a glimpse of what had captured their boss's attention, but Min-joon tilted the phone away, a reflexive gesture of protection that surprised even himself. The men across the table held their breath, expecting fury, expecting consequences for whatever had interrupted the proceedings. Instead, Min-joon stared at the image for several long seconds, reading the message that accompanied it. There was something achingly real about it, something that pierced through the armor he'd carefully constructed over decades of living in a world where vulnerability meant death. In his 32 years, Min-joon had seen every kind of human interaction reduced to transactions, power plays, manipulations. But this accidental glimpse into someone's private moment of fear and hope, was different. He shouldn't respond. Every instinct honed by years of survival in a dangerous world told him to delete the message, block the number, forget he'd ever seen it. Instead, his thumbs moved across the screen, typing words that felt foreign. Wrong number. But congratulations on your pregnancy. He hit send before he could reconsider, then immediately set the phone face down on the table and returned his attention to the meeting, his expression once again becoming the mask of cold authority his associates expected. But his mind wasn't fully present anymore. Some part of him wondered if the woman would respond, and more puzzling, why he cared. Back in her apartment, Amara had just settled onto her couch with her chamomile tea when her phone chimed. She picked it up, expecting Jasmine's usual enthusiastic response peppered with heart emojis and words of encouragement. Instead, she saw the message from an unknown number and felt her heart drop into her stomach. Wrong number. Oh God, she'd sent that intimate photo to a complete stranger. Her fingers flew across the screen in a panic. Oh my God, I am so sorry. I meant to send that to my friend Jasmine. I must have typed the number wrong. Please delete that photo. I'm so embarrassed. I'm really sorry. She waited, mortified, watching the 3 dots appear that indicated the person was typing. When the response came, it surprised her. Already deleted. No need to apologize. These things happen. Are you okay? You mentioned being scared. Amara blinked at her screen, reading the message 3 times. A stranger, someone she'd accidentally intruded upon with her pregnancy photo, was asking if she was okay. The unexpected kindness made her eyes sting with tears, which seemed to be her default emotional response these days. Her pregnancy hormones had turned her into someone who cried at insurance commercials and got emotional over properly sorted recycling. She found herself typing back, I'm okay. It's been a rough few months. I'm doing this alone and sometimes it feels overwhelming. But I'll be fine. Thank you for asking. And again, I'm so sorry for the random baby bump photo. The response came quickly, you don't have to keep apologizing. And for what it's worth, you looked happy in the photo. That's what matters. Something about those words, simple as they were, touched something deep inside Amara. This stranger had seen past her exhaustion, past her fear, and recognized the happiness that existed despite everything else. She smiled through her tears and typed, thank you. I needed to hear that today. What followed over the next hour was one of the strangest conversations Amara had ever had. The mysterious person on the other end, who introduced himself simply as MJ, asked practical questions about her situation. Was she getting proper prenatal care? Did she have a good doctor? Was she eating enough? There was something almost clinical about the questions, as if he was assessing a situation and determining what resources were needed, but underneath it, Amara sensed genuine concern. She found herself opening up to this stranger in a way she hadn't with anyone except Jasmine. Maybe it was because MJ was anonymous, a faceless voice in the digital void who had no preconceptions about who she should be or how she should feel. Or maybe it was because she was just so desperately lonely that any human connection felt like water in a desert. Min-joon, for his part, had excused himself from the meeting after delivering his verdict on the associate's unauthorized actions, a punishment swift and severe enough to ensure it would never happen again. Now he sat alone in his private office, the city lights of Seattle glittering below him like scattered diamonds, his phone in his hand as he continued this unexpected conversation with a woman named Amara. He told himself he was just ensuring she was safe, that this was simply his nature, assessing situations and solving problems. But he knew it was more than that. There was something about her messages, the honesty and vulnerability in her words, that called to a part of himself he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. The part that remembered what it was like to be human, to care about someone without calculation or ulterior motive. When Amara mentioned she was worried about affording proper prenatal vitamins and had been skipping some of her recommended supplements, Min-joon immediately sent her information about a clinic program he knew provided them free of charge. When she expressed anxiety about finding a good pediatrician for after the baby arrived, he forwarded her a comprehensive list of highly rated doctors in her area. He had resources at his fingertips that most people couldn't access, and for the first time in years he was using them for something purely good. As their conversation wound down late into the night, Amara typed, I can't believe I'm saying this to someone whose face I've never seen, but thank you, You've been kinder to me tonight than some people I've known for years. I don't know why you took the time to help a stranger, but it means more than you know. Min-joon stared at those words for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. Finally he typed, "Everyone needs someone in their corner, even if it's just a stranger with a wrong number. Take care of yourself, Amara. And that baby." He expected that to be the end of it. But as he lay in his bed that night, in his cold, pristine penthouse that reflected nothing of who he was and everything of what he'd become, Min-joon found himself thinking about Amara's smile in that photograph. And when his phone chimed the next evening with a message from her, just a simple, "Hope you're having a good day, MJ," he found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. Neither of them realized it yet, but that accidental message had set something in motion that would change both their lives forever. In a city of millions, two lonely souls had found each other through a wrong number, and sometimes, the universe worked in mysterious ways. 2 weeks had passed since that first accidental message, and what started as a simple mistake had evolved into something neither Amara nor Min-joon quite knew how to define. They texted daily now, sometimes multiple times a day, sharing pieces of their lives in the careful way people do when they're simultaneously craving connection and protecting themselves from it. Amara had taken to calling him MJ, while he'd started referring to her as Sunshine, a nickname that emerged after she'd sent him a particularly cheerful message about feeling the baby kick for the first time. For Amara, these conversations had become a lifeline. MJ was steady, reliable, and offered perspective that felt both worldly and strangely detached from normal social expectations. He never judged her for admitting she was scared, never told her everything would magically be fine with empty platitudes. Instead, he offered practical solutions, asked thoughtful questions, and listened in a way that made her feel truly heard. She knew almost nothing concrete about him, just that he worked in business, kept unusual hours, and seemed to know an extraordinary amount about everything from prenatal nutrition to tenant rights law. Min-joon, meanwhile, found himself structuring his days around Amara's messages. In the middle of tense negotiations with international distributors, he'd feel his phone vibrate and know it was her, telling him about a pregnancy craving she'd satisfied or a tiny outfit she'd found at a thrift store. His associates had noticed the change in him, the way he'd excuse himself more frequently to check his phone, the slight softening around his eyes when he read something that amused him. Jin-woo, his most trusted confidant, had even worked up the courage to ask if everything was all right, to which Min-joon had responded with a look so cold that the question was never repeated. But everything wasn't all right, at least not for Amara. The financial pressures that had been mounting when she first accidentally texted Min-joon had only intensified. Her landlord, a perpetually irritated man named Mr. Kowalski who smelled like cigarettes and disappointment, had slipped a notice under her door announcing a rent increase of $300 a month starting in 30 days. The number might as well have been 3 million for all the possibility Amara had of meeting it. Then came the second blow. Her biggest client, a startup that had promised her 3 months of steady design work, sent a terse email explaining they'd decided to go in a different direction. The unspoken truth, which Amara understood perfectly, was that they didn't want to invest in a freelancer who would soon be unavailable due to childbirth and newborn care. Never mind that she'd explicitly assured them she could work remotely and maintain her deadlines. Pregnant women were liabilities in the eyes of many employers, regardless of what discrimination law said on paper. That evening, as rain once again battered her windows and the city lights blurred through the water streaming down the glass, Amara sat on her couch with her laptop open to her dwindling bank account and felt the crushing weight of reality settle over her. She'd been trying so hard to stay positive, to maintain the brave face she showed the world, but sometimes the fear was simply too big to contain. Her fingers found her phone almost automatically, opening the text thread with MJ. She started typing, then deleted it. Started again, deleted again. Finally, she just let the words pour out. "I don't know what to do anymore, MJ. My rent is going up, my biggest client just dropped me, and I have exactly 8 weeks until my due date to figure out how I'm going to support this baby. I'm trying so hard to keep it together, but I'm terrified. What if I can't do this? What if I'm not enough?" She hit send before she could overthink it, then immediately regretted burdening him with her problems. He was just someone she texted, not a friend obligated to deal with her emotional crises. But before she could type an apology, the 3 dots appeared. Across the city, Min-joon was in the back of his car being driven to a late-night meeting when Amara's message came through. He read it once, then again, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He'd been monitoring her situation peripherally through their conversations, noting the stress markers in her messages, the growing anxiety between her words. He'd been prepared to offer advice, perhaps direct her to additional resources. But this message was different. This was someone drowning and reaching for a lifeline. Min-joon made a decision that went against every rule he'd set for himself about maintaining distance from personal entanglements. He told his driver to change course, then typed a message to Amara. "You're not alone in this. I'd like to meet in person to discuss some possibilities. Are you free tomorrow afternoon?" In her apartment, Amara stared at the message with her heart hammering. Meet in person? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. MJ had become someone important to her, a constant in her chaotic life, but he was also still essentially a stranger. What if meeting ruined whatever this was? What if he was disappointed by the reality of her? What if he was someone dangerous? But desperation has a way of overriding caution, and Amara was desperate. She typed back, "Okay. There's a cafe called Moonbeam on Pike Street. 2 o'clock. His response was immediate, "I'll be there." That night Amara barely slept. She kept imagining different versions of MJ, too young, too old, creepy, married, normal, extraordinary. By the time morning came, she tried on and discarded 6 different outfits before settling on a simple navy blue maternity dress that was professional enough to seem like she had her life together while comfortable enough to accommodate her growing belly. She spent an unusual amount of time on her hair and makeup, then felt ridiculous for caring so much about impressing someone who'd already seen her at her most vulnerable. The Moonbeam Cafe was a cozy spot tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop, with large windows that looked out onto the busy street and mismatched furniture that gave it an eclectic charm. Amara arrived 15 minutes early, securing a corner table where she could watch the door. She ordered a decaf latte and a blueberry scone she had no appetite to eat, then waited, her hands wrapped around the warm mug for comfort more than warmth. Min-joon arrived exactly at 2 o'clock, because punctuality was both a habit and a weapon in his world. He'd dressed carefully for this meeting, expensive but understated, a charcoal suit without a tie, wanting to appear professional but not cold. As he pushed open the cafe door, his eyes scanned the space with the automatic threat assessment he performed in every new environment, noting exits, potential problems, the locations of every person present. Then he saw her and something in his chest seized. Amara was more beautiful than her photograph had conveyed, but that wasn't what struck him. It was the way she sat with her shoulders slightly hunched, protective of herself and her unborn child, the way her fingers nervously traced the rim of her coffee cup, the way her eyes lit with recognition and anxiety in equal measure when she spotted him. Amara watched as possibly the most striking man she'd ever seen walk directly toward her table. He was tall, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively move out of his way. His features were distinctly Korean, sharp and aristocratic, with dark eyes that seemed to see everything. He moved with a controlled grace that suggested either martial arts training or the kind of confidence that came from never having to question whether you belonged in a space. "Amara?" His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, with a slight accent that made her name sound exotic and beautiful. "Emmy," she breathed, suddenly feeling very young and very underdressed despite her careful preparations. Please sit down." Min-joon slid into the chair across from her, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Years of digital conversation suddenly made flesh and real and complicated. Up close, he could see the faint freckles across her nose, the way her natural curls framed her face, the exhaustion she tried to hide behind a smile. She could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes, the tension he carried in his shoulders, the way his expensive watch caught the light when he moved. "Thank you for meeting me," Min-joon said, his tone formal, professional. "I know this might seem unusual, but I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe I have a proposition that could benefit us both." Amara's eyebrows rose. "A proposition?" "I own several technology companies," he explained, which was true if incomplete. "One of them is launching a new product line in 3 months and needs extensive design work. Branding, marketing materials, user interface elements, packaging. I've looked at your portfolio online. Your work is exactly what we need." This was partially true. Min-joon did need design work done, though he had a full creative team perfectly capable of handling it. But he'd spent the previous night reviewing every piece of work Amara had ever posted publicly, and he'd been genuinely impressed by her talent. She had an eye for color and composition that was both sophisticated and accessible, exactly the kind of approach his consumer products needed. Amara felt hope and suspicion warring in her chest. "MJ, I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept charity. I need to stand on my own." "This isn't charity," Min-joon said, and the firmness in his voice made it clear he meant it. "I'm offering you a contract position based on your skills. The pay is competitive, $75,000 for 6 months of work, with the flexibility to work remotely and set your own hours. If you deliver quality work, which I believe you will, there's potential for extension or permanent placement." $75,000. Amara felt dizzy. That was more money than she'd made in the previous 2 years combined. It would cover her increased rent, her medical bills, everything her baby would need. It was a life raft thrown to a drowning person. It was also, her instincts whispered, too good to be true. Why? She asked bluntly. You barely know me. Why would you offer this to a stranger you met through a wrong number? Min-joon had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer that was honest enough. Because I've spent my entire career making decisions based on calculated risks. I've seen your work, I've gotten to know your character through our conversations, and I believe you'll deliver excellent results. Also, he paused, something softening in his expression, because sometimes the universe puts people in our path for a reason, and I've learned to pay attention when it does. They talked for 2 hours in that cafe discussing the scope of the project, the timeline, the expectations. Min-joon was professional and thorough, pulling up examples on his tablet of the kind of work he envisioned. Amara asked intelligent questions, pushed back on some of the timelines, negotiated for certain tools and resources she'd need. Watching her advocate for herself, seeing the sharp mind behind her vulnerable exterior, Min-joon felt his respect for her deepen. As their meeting wound down, Amara felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Real, tangible hope that maybe she could do this, maybe she could provide for her baby, maybe everything would be okay. She extended her hand across the table. You have a deal, MJ. Min-joon took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against his, noticing how small her hand was in his, how trust was written across her face despite having every reason to be cautious. Welcome to the team, sunshine. What neither of them said, what hung in the air between them as they exchanged smiles across that cafe table, was that this business arrangement felt like something else entirely. It felt like the beginning of something they didn't yet have words for, something that scared them both because it mattered in a way business deals weren't supposed to matter. As Amara walked home that evening, her hand resting on her belly as the baby did acrobatics inside her, she felt lighter than she had in months. She didn't see Min-joon watching from his car parked a block away, making sure she got home safely, his phone already open to message his security team about implementing discreet protection for her building. And when Min-joon finally drove back to his penthouse, he didn't acknowledge to himself that he'd just made the first truly selfless decision of his adult life, or that Amara Williams had somehow become the most important person in his carefully constructed world. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud even to oneself. But the truth had a way of making itself known regardless, and in the weeks that followed as they worked together and Min-joon found increasingly transparent excuses to check on her in person, as Amara began to rely on his steady presence and wonder what she'd ever done without him, they both began to realize that their wrong number had been right in all the ways that mattered. The next 2 months passed in a blur of design work, prenatal appointments, and a growing connection that neither Amara nor Min-joon quite knew how to name. What had started as a business arrangement had evolved into something far more complex and profound. Min-joon showed up at Amara's apartment 3 times a week, ostensibly to review her design progress but really just to see her, to make sure she was eating properly, to carry her groceries up the stairs because he'd convinced himself those 2 flights were too much for a pregnant woman. Amara, for her part, found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She'd catch herself checking her reflection before he arrived, lighting the candle that made her apartment smell like vanilla and cinnamon, wearing the maternity clothes that made her feel pretty rather than just comfortable. They'd spend hours talking about everything and nothing. His childhood in Seoul before his family moved to the States when he was 12, her memories of growing up in Atlanta with a mother who taught her that creativity was its own form of power, their shared love of old noir films and the way rain sounded against windows. What Min-joon never mentioned was the extensive background his organization was conducting on everyone in Amara's life, ensuring no threat could reach her. What he didn't say was that he'd quietly paid off her landlord to keep her rent at its current level for the next 2 years, or that he'd made sure the clinic she attended had the best equipment money could buy. He told himself these were just precautions, just his nature to control variables and eliminate problems. But late at night, in the darkness of his penthouse, he admitted to himself that he was falling in love with her, and that terrified him more than any enemy he'd ever faced. Amara also had her secrets. She'd started looking up Min-joon's companies online, and what she found both impressed and unsettled her. His business empire was vast and successful, but there were gaps in the public record, questions asked but never answered about certain associates, certain dealings. She'd stumbled across an article speculating about possible organized crime connections to Kong Enterprises, though nothing had ever been proven. She wanted to ask him directly, but fear of the answer kept her silent. Instead, she chose to believe in the man who brought her soup when she was sick, who assembled the crib she'd purchased secondhand with a patience that suggested he'd never held a screwdriver before, who looked at her with such intensity it made her breath catch. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in her 7th month of pregnancy. Amara had a routine ultrasound scheduled, and for the first time since they'd started working together, Min-joon had called to cancel their meeting, citing an urgent business matter. She told herself she wasn't disappointed, that she didn't need him there, that she was perfectly capable of attending appointments alone as she'd planned to do all along. But as she sat in the examination room, the cold gel on her belly and the technician moving the wand across her skin, she felt acutely alone. The monitor showed her daughter, because she'd finally found out she was having a girl, moving and stretching in the small space she occupied. The technician turned on the sound, and suddenly the room filled with the rapid swoosh 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 of a heartbeat, strong and steady and real. Tears streamed down Amara's face before she could stop them. This was her baby, her daughter, her responsibility and her joy, and she was going to meet her in just a few short weeks. The weight of it, the beauty and terror of it, overwhelmed her completely. Outside in the hallway, Min-joon stood frozen, his hand raised to knock on the examination room door. His urgent business matter had been resolved in 20 minutes through a few well-placed threats and strategic compromises, and he'd driven directly to the clinic, knowing Amara's appointment time, knowing he should give her space but unable to stay away. Through the door, he heard her crying, heard the rapid heartbeat that he understood must be the baby's, and something inside him shattered and reformed simultaneously. He knocked softly, then entered without waiting for permission. The technician looked up in surprise, but one glance at his face told her this was someone who belonged here. Amara's head turned, her face wet with tears, her expression cycling through surprise to joy to relief. "MJ," she whispered. "You came." Min-joon crossed to her in 3 strides, taking her hand without thinking about whether he should, his eyes fixed on the monitor where this tiny human was making her presence known. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't know how to process. "I should have been here from the beginning." The technician, sensing something significant happening, quietly stepped out to give them privacy. Min-joon and Amara sat together in that small room, hands clasped, watching the monitor as the baby moved and stretched. When Amara laughed through her tears at a particularly vigorous kick that was visible on screen, Min-joon felt something he'd never experienced before. A fierce, protective love for this child who wasn't his, for this woman who'd become his entire world through an accident neither of them could have predicted. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "Like her mother." Amara turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw past the expensive suit and the controlled expression to the man underneath, vulnerable, scared, hoping. "MJ, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me." Min-joon's body tensed. This was the moment he'd been dreading, when she'd ask about the parts of his life he'd carefully hidden. "Okay. Who are you really? Not just the business success story but all of it. Because I'm falling in love with you, and I need to know what I'm falling into." The confession hung between them, brave and terrifying. Min-joon could have lied, could have given her a sanitized version of the truth. Instead, because she deserved better and because he was tired of pretending, he told her everything. He spoke quietly, his hand still holding hers, about his family's organization, about the legitimate businesses that were real but also served as fronts, about the gray area between legal and illegal that he navigated daily, about the violence he'd witnessed and sometimes ordered, about the man he'd become in order to survive in a world that didn't forgive weakness. Amara listened, her face growing paler with each revelation, her hand tightening on his as if she was afraid of letting go but equally afraid of holding on. When he finished, silence filled the room, broken only by the continued swoosh of the baby's heartbeat on the monitor the technician had left running. "I understand if you want me to leave," Min-joon said, his voice carefully neutral despite the pain threading through his chest. "I'll ensure the contract is fulfilled, you'll still have the job and the income, but I'll stay away from you personally. You and your daughter deserve better than the danger my world represents." Amara closed her eyes, her hand moving to her belly where her daughter continued her gymnastics, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around her. She thought about the man who'd shown up at her ultrasound despite canceling their meeting, who'd held her hand through her tears, who'd looked at her unborn daughter with such wonder and love. She thought about the life he'd described, the dangers and the moral ambiguities. She thought about what her mother would say, what any rational person would advise. Then she opened her eyes and said, "I'm scared. Of your world, of what it means, of the risks. But I'm more scared of losing you. So I need you to promise me something." Min-joon's heart, which had been preparing for rejection, stuttered with hope. "Anything. Promise me you'll do everything in your power to keep yourself safe. Promise me you'll find a way to leave the dangerous parts behind, even if it takes time. And promise me you'll never lie to me again about anything. I promise, Min-joon said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. He would burn his organization to the ground if that's what it took to be worthy of her trust. Amara nodded slowly, then did something that surprised both of them. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him, her pregnant belly making the embrace awkward but no less meaningful. Min-joon held her carefully as if she was made of spun glass, his face buried in her hair, breathing in the coconut scent of her shampoo. It was the first real hug he'd shared with anyone in over a decade. In his world, physical contact was either violent or transactional, never tender, never given freely. But this, Amara's arms around him, her breath warm against his neck, her trust offered despite having every reason to withhold it, was something entirely different. It was grace he didn't deserve and hadn't earned, but he clung to it anyway, silently vowing to become the man she seemed to believe he could be. They stayed like that for a long moment, two damaged people finding unexpected healing in each other's arms, while on the monitor behind them, a baby's heartbeat kept its steady rhythm, oblivious to everything except its own determined existence. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Min-joon began the delicate, dangerous process of extracting himself from his family's criminal operations, passing responsibilities to others, making strategic alliances, and occasionally making threats when alliances weren't enough. He attended meetings with lawyers and accountants, restructuring his business holdings, creating legitimate pathways for income that had previously flowed through darker channels. It was slow, painstaking work that made him enemies among those who preferred the old ways. Jin-woo, his second-in-command, confronted him one evening in his office. "You're going to get yourself killed over this woman," he said bluntly. "The family won't accept this much change this quickly. They'll see it as weakness." "Then let them," Min-joon replied, his voice cold and final. "I'm done living for their approval. I'm done sacrificing everything good for an organization that will replace me the moment I become inconvenient." Jin-woo studied his boss for a long moment, then surprised Min-joon by smiling slightly. "She must be extraordinary." "She is." Meanwhile, Amara grew larger and more uncomfortable as her due date approached. Her apartment seemed to shrink around her expanding body, and simple tasks like putting on shoes became Olympic events. But she was also happier than she'd been in months, maybe years. Min-joon was a constant presence now, bringing her meals from restaurants she could never afford, sitting with her during late-night Braxton Hicks contractions that scared her until he calmly explained what they were and why they were normal, reading pregnancy books with the same intense focus he brought to business contracts. They talked about everything: their hopes for Amara's daughter, their fears about parenthood, the life they were cautiously beginning to imagine together. Min-joon never presumed to insert himself into her daughter's life, never claim a parental role he hadn't earned, but the gentle way he'd place his hand on Amara's belly to feel the baby kick spoke volumes about the bond he was forming with this unborn child. 2 weeks before her due date, everything changed. Amara received a text message from an unknown number, a photograph of her leaving her apartment building, taken from across the street, with a single line of text: "Tell your Korean boyfriend his enemies know where to find his weaknesses." She called Min-joon immediately, her voice shaking. He was there within 15 minutes, his face a mask of cold fury that reminded her exactly who he'd been before they met. That night, she learned the extent of his protective measures. The security team that had been discreetly watching her building for weeks, the cameras he'd had installed, the contingency plans he'd made for exactly this scenario. "You should have told me," Amara said, torn between gratitude and anger that he'd made these decisions without her input. "Would you have allowed it?" Min-joon countered. "No. But you still should have told me." He nodded, accepting the reprimand. "You're right. I'm sorry. But Amara, I need you to understand something. There are people who would hurt you to get to me. I can't." His voice broke slightly, a crack in his controlled facade. "I can't lose you. Either of you." That night, Min-joon made the decision he'd been avoiding. He called a meeting with the heads of the Kong family organization and announced his complete withdrawal. He offered them generous buyouts, transition plans, promises of non-interference. What he didn't offer was room for negotiation. He was done, effective immediately, and he'd protected himself well enough through years of careful documentation that they couldn't move against him without destroying themselves. Some accepted. Others didn't. But Min-joon had learned long ago that power wasn't just about violence, it was about information, leverage, and the will to use both without hesitation. By sunrise he was free, or as free as anyone ever was from that world. He went directly to Amara's apartment, exhausted and still wearing the same suit from the night before. She opened the door, took one look at his face and pulled him inside without a word. They lay together on her couch, her head on his chest, his hand on her belly, neither speaking but both understanding that something fundamental had shifted. 3 days later, Amara went into labor. It started with a backache she dismissed, progressed to contractions she tried to time on her own, and culminated in her water breaking at 2 in the morning as she stood in her kitchen trying to decide if she should go to the hospital or wait. She called Min-joon trying to sound calm and failing completely. He arrived in record time, moving with the efficient urgency of someone who'd prepared for this moment. He had her hospital bag, which he'd packed weeks ago with her input, and he stayed calm even when she had a contraction in the car so intense she crushed his hand and said things about his ancestry she'd later apologize for. The labor was long and difficult. Amara labored for 16 hours and Min-joon stayed by her side through all of it. He held her hand during contractions, wiped her face with cool cloths, breathed with her when the pain was overwhelming, and never once flinched or looked away. In those hours, stripped of all pretense and armor, they were just two people bringing a life into the world, and the love between them needed no words. When Amara's daughter finally entered the world at 6:47 p.m. with a cry that sounded indignant at the sudden cold and brightness, Min-joon felt tears stream down his face for the first time since he was a child. The nurse placed the baby on Amara's chest, and in that moment, watching Amara sob with joy and exhaustion, watching this tiny perfect human squirm and cry, he understood what people meant when they talked about life-changing moments. "She's perfect," Amara whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "She's absolutely perfect." The baby had Amara's nose and a shock of dark hair that stood up in every direction. Her skin was the color of rich earth, and when she finally opened her eyes, they were dark and alert, taking in this strange new world with what seemed like ancient wisdom. "What's her name?" Min-joon asked softly, careful not to presume he had any say in the decision. Amara looked at him, this man who'd entered her life through an accident and stayed through choice, who'd shown her what real partnership looked like, who'd held her hand through the hardest moments and never let go. "Zara," she said. "It means blooming flower, in Arabic. Because she bloomed from something that seemed like an ending but was really a beginning." Min-joon reached out with one finger, touching Zara's tiny hand. She immediately grasped it with surprising strength, and he felt his heart break open in a way he hadn't known was possible. "Hello, Zara," he whispered. "I've been waiting to meet you." The nurse, who'd seen countless births and countless emotional moments, later told her colleague she'd never seen a man look at a baby with such pure, unguarded love. She'd also noticed he wasn't wearing a wedding ring and the mother hadn't listed a father on the intake forms, but the way he looked at both of them told a story that didn't need official documentation. Over the next 2 days in the hospital, Min-joon barely left their room. He learned to change diapers with the focused determination he'd once applied to hostile takeovers. He paced the halls with Zara when she cried and Amara needed to rest. He took photos with his phone that he'd look at during meetings for months afterward, reminding himself what mattered. It was during one of these quiet moments, at 3 in the morning when the hospital was hushed and Amara was sleeping, that Min-joon sat in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed with Zara in his arms, and made a promise. He promised this child that he would protect her, guide her, love her as if she were his own. He promised he would be the father figure she deserved, if Amara would let him. He promised he would build a life worthy of being part of theirs. When Amara woke and saw him there, still holding Zara, still keeping watch, she knew with absolute certainty that her accidental text message had been the universe's way of giving her exactly what she needed, even before she knew she needed it. 3 months later, they'd settled into a rhythm that felt like family even if the official paperwork didn't reflect it yet. Min-joon had purchased a house in a quiet Seattle neighborhood, not the penthouse that reflected his old life, but a real home with a yard and neighbors and a nursery painted soft yellow because Amara said she wanted sunshine for their daughter. Their daughter. The possessive had slipped into casual use without either of them making a formal declaration, a natural evolution that felt right. Min-joon had been right about Amara's design work being exceptional. The product line she'd branded had launched to critical acclaim, and she'd received offers from other companies. But she'd stayed with his firm, now heading a small creative team and working flexible hours that allowed her to be present for Zara's daily moments. They still hadn't defined exactly what they were to each other. Not married, not quite traditional partners, but something deeper and more essential. They were co-parents, best friends, lovers in the gentle way of people building something meant to last. Min-joon had his own room in the house, though most nights he ended up wherever Amara and Zara were, drawn to them like a compass finding true north. One evening, as autumn painted Seattle in shades of amber and rust, Min-joon arrived home from the office to find Amara in the nursery, rocking Zara and humming softly. He stood in the doorway watching them, still amazed that this was his life now. No violence, no constant vigilance, no cold isolation. Just warmth and love and the sweet exhaustion of caring for an infant who'd recently discovered her lungs had impressive capacity. Amara looked up and smiled, the expression that never failed to make his chest tight. She's fighting sleep again. I think she inherited your stubbornness. My stubbornness? Min-joon crossed to them, gently taking Zara from Amara's arms. She's all you, sunshine. Strong-willed and absolutely convinced the world should operate on her schedule. He settled into the rocking chair with practiced ease, Zara's small body warm against his chest. She looked up at him with her dark eyes that reminded him of Amara's in certain lights, and made a small sound of contentment before her eyelids began to droop. Amara sat on the ottoman beside them, her hand resting on Min-joon's knee, watching the man she loved rock her daughter to sleep with a tenderness that still surprised her after months of witnessing it. MJ, she said softly, do you ever regret it? Walking away from everything you built? Min-joon didn't answer immediately. He thought about his old life, the power, the fear he commanded, the empire he'd controlled. Then he looked down at Zara, now sleeping peacefully against him, her tiny hand fisted in his shirt. He thought about waking up to Amara's smile, about family dinners and mundane conversations about diaper brands and whether the weird noise Zara made was normal or required a pediatrician visit. Not even once, he said finally, meeting Amara's eyes. I thought I was powerful before. But this, being trusted with her, being part of your lives, this is real power. Everything else was just smoke and mirrors. Amara felt tears prick her eyes, the happy kind that came frequently these days. I love you, she said, simple and true. I know we haven't made it official or defined all the terms, but I love you, Kang Min-joon. You and your stubbornness and your terrible singing voice when you think no one's listening and the way you love my daughter like she's yours. Min-joon's throat tightened. He carefully stood, still holding Zara, and crossed to place her in her crib. She fussed briefly but settled, her small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. Then he turned to Amara and pulled her into his arms, holding her with the same fierce gentleness he'd shown that day in the ultrasound room. She is mine, he said against her hair. Maybe not biologically, but in every way that matters. And so are you. I've been yours since the moment you accidentally sent me that picture and showed me what it looked like when someone smiled without calculation or agenda. You taught me how to be human again, Amara. How to love without expecting something in return. How to be vulnerable and call it strength. They stood like that for a long moment, in the soft glow of the night light shaped like a smiling moon, while their daughter slept and the life they'd built together settled around them like a blessing. 6 months later, on a spring morning when the rain had finally given way to sunshine and the cherry blossoms were blooming throughout the city, Min-joon woke early. He looked at Amara sleeping beside him. They'd stopped pretending to maintain separate rooms 3 months ago, and then walked quietly to the nursery where Zara was beginning to stir in her crib. At 11 months old, Zara was a force of nature. She'd inherited Amara's smile and stubbornness, and she'd recently started pulling herself up on furniture, determined to walk before her first birthday despite having no sense of balance whatsoever. Min-joon lifted her from the crib, kissing her forehead as she babbled at him in her own language. Good morning, little one, he whispered. Want to help me with something? He carried her downstairs to the kitchen, setting her in her high chair with some cereal puffs to occupy her while he made coffee. On the kitchen table sat a small velvet box he'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Inside was a ring, not ostentatious but beautiful, with a single diamond surrounded by smaller stones in a setting that reminded him of how small moments of light could illuminate an entire life. But there was something else he needed to do first. He pulled out his phone and began recording a video, propping it up so it captured both him and Zara. Okay, Zara, he said, sitting beside her high chair. Let's practice. Can you say mama? Zara looked at him, cereal puff clutched in her fist, and let out a stream of babbling that contained no recognizable words. Come on, Min-joon encouraged. Mama. I know you can do it. We've been working on this for weeks. More babbling. Then clear as day Zara said, Dada. Min-joon froze. It wasn't the first time she'd made that sound, but it was the first time she'd said it while looking directly at him, with what seemed like intention. His eyes stung with tears as Zara smiled at him, pleased with his reaction, and said it again. Dada. He picked her up, holding her close, breathing in the baby shampoo smell of her hair. Yeah, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Yeah, I'm your dada if you want me to be. That's how Amara found them 20 minutes later, when she wandered downstairs looking for her family. Min-joon was on the floor with Zara, who was attempting to walk between the coffee table and the couch while he spotted her, both of them laughing when she plopped down on her padded bottom. What's all this excitement? Amara asked, unable to stop smiling at the scene. Min-joon looked up at her and she saw tears on his face, happy ones. Zara said her first real word. Well, not the word we were practicing, but still. Oh my god, what did she say? Please tell me you got it on video. I did. He pulled out his phone, playing back the recording. When Amara heard her daughter clearly say, Dada, while looking at Min-joon, her own tears started falling. She breathed. I know we haven't discussed it officially, Min-joon said, standing and crossing to her, taking her hands in his. And I know the conventional order is to do this first before living together and co-parenting. But our story has never been conventional. It started with a wrong number and grew into the most right thing in my life. He pulled out the velvet box, opening it to reveal the ring. Amara Williams, would you marry me? Would you let me be Zara's father officially? Would you build the rest of this beautiful, chaotic, perfect life with me? Amara looked at the ring, then at Min-joon's face, then over at Zara, who was pulling herself up on the couch again, determined and fearless. She thought about that rainy night when she'd sent a picture to a wrong number, never imagining it would lead here. She thought about how Min-joon had shown up for every moment, big and small, how he'd changed his entire life to be worthy of being part of theirs. Yes, she said, laughing and crying simultaneously. Yes to all of it. Though I should warn you, you're getting a package deal. Late-night feedings, toddler tantrums, all of it. I wouldn't want it any other way. Min-joon slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her softly, reverently, while behind them Zara clapped her hands and shouted, Dada. Again, pleased to have an audience for her new word. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony with close friends and family, with Zara as the flower girl who mostly just ate the petals from the basket they'd given her. Jinwoo stood as Min-joon's best man, and Jasmine finally met the man whose wrong number had changed her best friend's life, declaring him acceptable after a thorough interrogation. Years passed. Zara grew into a bright, curious child who loved art like her mother and had her father's strategic mind. She never remembered a time when Min-joon wasn't her dad, and when she was old enough to understand the story, she declared it the most romantic thing ever and insisted they tell it at every family gathering. Min-joon built his legitimate business empire into something he was genuinely proud of, creating jobs and opportunities without the shadow of his past life. Amara's design firm became one of Seattle's most sought-after agencies. They bought a bigger house when Zara was 5 and they were expecting their second child, a boy they named Marcus, after Amara decided to reclaim the name with new, better associations. But what neither of them ever forgot was that first moment of connection, that accidental message that led to an intentional life. On their anniversary each year, Min-joon would send Amara a text with a picture of their family. First just the 3 of them, then 4, then 5 when their daughter Lily arrived. And every time he'd write the same message, still the best wrong number I ever got. Amara would respond, wrong number, right person. Always. Because sometimes the universe worked in mysterious ways, and sometimes a mistake was actually destiny wearing a clever disguise. They'd both been lost in their own ways when that message was sent. Amara abandoned and afraid, Min-joon isolated and hardened. But together they'd found their way home. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more unexpected love stories that remind us how the smallest moments can change everything. What's the most unexpected way you've met someone important in your life? Share your stories in the comments below. I'd love to hear how the universe brought you together with the people who matter most. Remember, sometimes the wrong number leads to exactly the right person. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next story.